Welcome to the Pages of Time channel. Today we are going to explore a dark chapter in human history, the torture techniques used throughout the ages. We all know that medieval times weren't exactly peaceful or tolerant, especially for women and those who disagreed with the church's power. The most varied instruments of torture were created to punish those who dared to challenge established standards. It is disturbing to think of how people have suffered slowly in the past if those in power thought they had done something wrong. Still, it's important to remember that these torture techniques aren't, or at least shouldn't be, part of our world anymore. Let's start by exploring the method of impalement, one of the cruelest forms of torture. Used by different civilizations around the world, mainly in Europe and Arabia, it consisted of inserting a long iron stake through the anus, vagina, abdomen or navel of the victim, leaving him with the object trapped inside the body until the death. In some circumstances, stakes were placed over hot coals to prolong the agony, causing the victim to hemorrhage for hours before succumbing. Another sinister instrument is known as the fork of the heretics or medieval fork. This utensil was characterized by having two opposite sharp ends attached to the victim's neck, preventing him from lowering his head. If he gave in to fatigue and his head lowered, the fork would pierce his chest and throat. Mainly used during the Spanish Inquisition, this cruel instrument caused a slow and painful death. The torture collar was a terrible test of endurance. The person was forced to wear a collar with sharp spikes pointed at the neck. With that, she couldn't sleep, eat, or even move her head. As with the heretic's fork, exhaustion eventually caused the victims to give in, resulting in the spikes piercing their necks. Imagine the horror of being imprisoned in a torture coffin. Victims were placed in suspended cages so that everyone could witness their suffering. Once imprisoned, they were not released, starving and exposed to weather conditions. In some cases, victims were placed naked. While the bodies remained on public display, crows fed on the remains. The screw, an instrument with several variations, was mainly used to slowly crush fingers and toes when interrogators sought to obtain information from victims. There were versions that could slowly crush the head, as well as other devices adapted for knees and elbows. The stretcher was one of the most cruel forms of torture in the medieval age. Its purpose was to dislocate all the joints in the victim's body. When lying on the stretcher, all the extremities of the body were slowly displaced by the extremities of the structure. In some extreme cases, victims' limbs were ripped off. The Judas chair, a brutal apparatus used in Europe until the 18th century, consisted of a chair filled with sharp iron spikes. With between 500 and 1,500 points, the victims were tied to the chair by leather straps. Furthermore, the chairs could be heated, adding more suffering to the torture. Saw torture was a method used for public executions, where victims were sawn in half. They were placed upside down, allowing blood to pool in the head and keeping them conscious during the act. Often, victims were not sawn completely, but only partially, prolonging their agony before death. These are just a few disturbing examples of torture techniques that have been used throughout history. It is essential to remember these horrors in order to value society's advances and ensure that such practices do not happen again. Fortunately, we live in a time when justice and respect for human rights are valued more than ever. I hope you have been able to understand the magnitude of the suffering that people have faced in the past and that we can learn from these dark moments in history to build a better and more humane future. Don't forget to leave your comments and share the video to spread this knowledge. Until next time, on the Pages of Time channel.